The sound of glass shattering stays with you, not the crash itself, the half second before it, when you see his hand moving and you know exactly what's about to happen and you can't stop it. That was my retirement dinner. 31 years at Maplewood Construction. I built that company from a 2-truck operation out of a rented garage in Akron, Ohio, into a regional contractor with 43 full-time employees and contracts across 4 states. When I stepped down at 62, my partners threw me a dinner at the Lantern Room, the kind of place with cloth napkins folded into swans and a wine list thicker than most paperback novels. My wife, my daughter, my son-in-law, a room full of people who'd worked beside me for decades. My son-in-law stood up to give a toast. His name is Colton. My daughter Nina met him 6 years ago at a corporate networking event in Columbus. He was 31, good-looking in the kind of way that photographs. Well, and he spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told no. Nina brought him home for Thanksgiving that first year, and I remember watching him at the dinner table. The way he interrupted my wife mid-sentence, laughed it off, moved on. The way he looked at the house, at the furniture, at the framed photos of our lake property up north. Not looking at them, appraising them. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Nina was 34 and she'd been lonely. She lit up around him. My wife Martha said I was seeing problems that weren't there. Maybe I was. I paid for the wedding. $220,000 at a vineyard outside of Napa. I wrote the check without blinking because Nina cried happy tears when she saw the venue, and that was enough for me. I paid for the down payment on their house in Dublin, Ohio. $85,000 toward a house I'd been inside maybe a dozen times since the day they moved in. I co-signed on Colton's business loan when his commercial landscaping startup needed capital and the bank wanted more collateral than he had. $400,000. I signed my name. 6 years of this. 6 years of being tolerable to my face and dismissive behind my back. Nina mentioned once carefully that Colton found me overwhelming. I filed that away. So he stood up at my retirement dinner with his champagne flute and his sport coat, and he smiled at the room and he said, "I want to say something about the man of the hour." I thought, here it comes. The toast, the moment. He said, "Norman has been a very generous father-in-law." He paused, let the room settle. But I think we can all agree that generosity and greatness aren't the same thing. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something wrong has entered them. He kept going. He said I was a man who wrote checks instead of showing up. He said Nina had spent years managing my emotional limitations. He said that whatever Maplewood had become, it was built on the backs of people I underpaid, and that I should reflect on that legacy before accepting any applause. He said this with a smile, as though he were doing me a favor. As though honesty were a gift he was presenting to me in front of my employees, my friends, my wife of 38 years. Martha reached over and put her hand on my arm. I felt her fingers pressing in, asking me to stay still. I stayed still. I looked at Nina. She was staring at her plate. I looked at Colton. He raised his glass. "To Norman," he said. Nobody clapped. Someone near the back of the room started to and then stopped. The silence stretched out long enough to become its own thing. Colton sat down and took a sip of his champagne like a man who had just delivered a sermon and was pleased with himself. I picked up my fork and finished my dinner. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moments that change everything. They don't feel cinematic. You don't feel cinematic. You don't flip the table. You don't say the perfect, devastating thing. You sit there and you chew your food, and the grief and the fury and something colder than both of them settle into the back of your chest like sediment, and you let them sit there. You let them become useful. I drove Martha home. She cried quietly in the passenger seat, and I kept both hands on the wheel. When we got inside, she asked me what I was going to do. I told her I didn't know yet. She looked at me long enough to know that wasn't entirely true. 3 days later, I called my attorney. His name is Douglas Fenn, and I've used him for business matters since 1998. I told him what happened and what I wanted, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How thorough do you want to be?" I told him thorough. First, I looked at the business loan. When I co-signed 4 years ago, the agreement included a standard material change clause. If there was a significant shift in the borrower's business structure without co-sign and notification, I had grounds to call the note. In the past 18 months, Colton had quietly brought on a partner and restructured the LLC without telling me or the bank. He'd sent me a one-line email about it that I had never responded to because at the time, I didn't think it mattered. It mattered now. I had Douglas send formal notice to Colton's bank that I was invoking my rights under the clause and requesting full review of the loan terms. The bank's response came back in 11 days. They were not pleased with what the audit turned up about the restructuring. The loan went into technical default review. Colton called me 3 days after that. I didn't answer. Second, I looked at the house. When I gave Nina and Colton the down payment 6 years ago, I was careful. My accountant at the time suggested I structure it as a documented loan rather than a gift, for tax purposes, with a promissory note. The interest rate was nominal, symbolic, the kind of thing families do on paper and then quietly forget about. I had not forgotten about it. I had the original signed note in a fireproof box in my study. I had Douglas send a formal demand letter for repayment under the original terms. $85,000 plus 6 years of nominal interest. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Nina called me that Thursday. I answered that one. She said, "Dad, what are you doing?" Not a question, a statement with the shape of a question. I said, "I'm putting my affairs in order." She said Colton was stressed. The business was in a difficult moment. This wasn't the time. I asked her if she'd enjoyed her dinner at the Lantern Room. She went quiet. I asked her what she'd been thinking while her husband spoke. She didn't answer that either. I told her I loved her. I told her I'd talk to her soon. I hung up. Third, I contacted my financial advisor. After the wedding, I had added Nina as a partial beneficiary on 2 of my investment accounts. Together they represented just over $900,000. These were not irrevocable designations. I spent an afternoon on the phone with my advisor, a woman named Patricia Hale, who has managed my retirement portfolio since 2014, and I updated the beneficiary paperwork. Nina remained on one account. The second, and larger account was redirected. I didn't tell anyone. Fourth, I made a phone call I'd been considering for 2 years. Colton's landscaping company had 3 municipal contracts in the Columbus area, parks maintenance, a school district grounds contract, and a streetscape project in Westerville. He'd gotten the Westerville contract 18 months earlier, which struck several people in the industry as unusual, given that his bid had come in notably below the next lowest offer in a way that didn't quite pencil out. I'd heard the word relationship used in connection with how that contract was awarded. I had nothing concrete. But I knew a man who sat on the city's procurement oversight board. We built a municipal project together in 2009 and stayed in loose contact. I called him. I told him what I'd heard. I told him I thought it warranted a look. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he appreciated me letting him know. 6 weeks later, Westerville announced an audit of 3 recent landscaping contracts. Colton's was one of them. His company was placed on administrative hold pending review. The school district, seeing the hold, quietly declined to renew their contract at the end of the quarter. I want to be precise about something here. I didn't fabricate anything. I didn't ask anyone to do anything improper. I passed along a concern I genuinely held to someone in an appropriate position to evaluate it. What happened next was the result of that evaluation, not of anything I manufactured. I want to be clear about that because there's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I don't believe I am, but I understand why someone might wonder. Colton's business was now dealing with a loan in default review, 2 lost municipal contracts, a procurement audit, and a partner who, I would learn later from a mutual acquaintance, had seen the writing on the wall and begun making quiet inquiries about separating from the LLC. I heard all of this second-hand in pieces over the course of about 2 months. I spent those 2 months doing other things. I drove up to our lake property in northern Ohio, a place I hadn't been to alone in years, and I spent 4 days there in October. The trees were at their peak. That particular combination of gold and rust and deep red that only lasts about a week if you're paying attention. I took the canoe out in the mornings. I cooked simple food. I called Martha every evening, and she told me about her day, and I told her about mine, and we talked the way we used to talk when we were younger, and things were simpler. I thought about Nina a great deal during those 4 days. I thought about the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms and ask me to tell her about the time I got lost in the woods, camping, and found my way out by following the creek. I'd told that story maybe 200 times. She never got tired of it. I thought about driving her to her first day of college and how she'd hugged me in the parking lot for longer than either of us expected, and how when she finally stepped back her eyes were red and she said, "You're the best, Dad," and I had to get back in the truck before I embarrassed myself completely. I thought about the man she'd chosen and about the woman she'd become around him. Quieter, careful. She'd stopped calling me with small things, the kind of calls that aren't about anything in particular, just staying in touch. Those had faded out somewhere in the last 3 years. On my last morning at the lake, I sat on the dock with a cup of coffee and watched the sun come up over the water. And I made a decision that felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement of something I'd already known. I was going to sell the lake property. I'd been meaning to update my estate documents anyway. I contacted Douglas when I got back, and we spent several sessions going through everything. The lake property went into a charitable remainder trust. The beneficiary was a workforce development non-profit in Akron that trains young adults in the construction trades. It's called BuildPath. I'd known the founder, a woman named Carla Simmons, for years. She'd started it with almost nothing, and it had placed over 300 people in living wage jobs in the past decade. The trust was structured so that Martha and I receive income from the property for the remainder of our lives, and upon our deaths the asset transfers fully to BuildPath. My estate documents were updated in full. I went through every account, every designation, every instrument. Douglas walked me through it line by line. When we were finished, I felt, for the first time since that dinner, like I could breathe without something pressing on my chest. I heard about what happened to Colton's business the way you hear about most things, gradually, then all at once. The loan default review concluded and the bank restructured the debt under terms that were, by any measure, severe. The partner exited the LLC, and Colton lost 2 of his best crew leads when the uncertainty got to be too much for them to stay. The municipal audit in Westerville found irregularities in the bidding process. Nothing that implicated Colton directly enough to result in charges, but enough that his company's name was in the public record as part of the review, which in the world of municipal contracting is nearly as damaging as a conviction. He lost his bonding capacity with his primary insurer. By January, the company was effectively dormant. I know all of this because Nina told me. She called me on a Wednesday evening in mid-January. Martha was in the other room. I took the call in my study. She said, "Dad, I need to talk to you." Her voice had a quality to it I hadn't heard in years. Unguarded, young. The way she used to sound when she called me from college about something that was wrong, and she needed help figuring out what to do about it. I said, "I'm listening." She talked for a long time. About the business. About the house, the loan demand, the mortgage payments without the business income. About Colton. About their marriage, carefully without saying too much. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she was scared. I said, "How long have you been scared?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "A while." I asked her what she needed right now, tonight, this week. She said she didn't know. I told her that whatever she decided to do about her marriage was her decision, and I would support her either way. I told her the loan demand was not going to disappear, and I wanted her to understand that, not as a punishment, but as a fact she needed to plan around. I told her there were resources available to her that were solely in her name, not connected to Colton, that she should know about. I gave her Douglas Fenn's direct number. I told her I loved her. She cried a little. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour. I did not say a word about what I had done or why. I didn't need to. She knew. I knew she knew. That was enough. 3 months after that call, Nina filed for divorce. I helped her find a good family law attorney. I paid the retainer. I am not going to pretend I was purely neutral on the subject of her marriage. I was not, and it would be dishonest to say otherwise. But the decision was hers. She made it in her own time, for her own reasons. Colton called me once during the divorce proceedings. I answered because I wanted to hear what he would say. He said I'd destroyed his life. He said I had systematically dismantled everything he'd built over 6 years out of wounded pride. He said I was a vindictive old man who couldn't handle being told the truth. His voice was tight, controlled, but underneath it there was something unraveling. I said, I paid for your wedding, your house and your business. I showed up to every dinner, every birthday, every holiday. I co-signed a loan because your own father wouldn't. I paused. And you stood up in front of everyone I've ever worked with and told them I was nothing. I paused again. That was your choice. What happened after was mine. He didn't say anything. I said, I hope things get easier for you. I mean that. I hung up. That fall, Martha and I drove up to see the lake property for the last time before the trust paperwork was finalised. The new dock had been finished before summer and we walked out to the end of it in the late afternoon light and stood there looking at the water. Martha took my hand. She didn't say much. She doesn't always need to. On the way home, she said, Do you feel like you did the right thing? I thought about it for a long time. Long enough that we'd passed 2 exits before I answered. I said, I feel like I did the honest thing. She nodded, kept looking out the window at the fields going past. Nina's going to be okay, Martha said. She is, I said. I believed it. She was already starting to sound like herself again. We'd had dinner together twice in the past month, just the 3 of us, and both times she'd laughed, really laughed, the way she used to, loose and unself-conscious at something I'd said. Small thing. I held on to it. There's a question I've been asked, or that I've asked myself, more times than I can count in the past year. Whether what I did was justice or revenge. Whether there's a difference. I think about Colton standing up in that room. The smile on his face, the particular cruelty of someone who understands exactly how much power they have over you and has decided to use it in public, in front of witnesses, on the night he was supposed to be celebrated. That wasn't honesty. Honest people pull you aside. They don't perform. I think about the loan I co-signed. The money I gave without conditions. The years I'd bit my tongue at dinners and holidays and said nothing because Nina was happy, or seemed happy, and that was what mattered. I think about the doctrine I have operated by my entire professional life, which is that a handshake means something and a signed document means something, and there are consequences when you violate either. I didn't break any rules. I called in debts that were legitimately mine to call. I reported a concern I genuinely had to an appropriate authority. I updated beneficiary designations that were always mine to update. These are not acts of war. These are the ordinary instruments of a man who knows how the world actually works, deployed carefully, quietly, and deliberately. The lantern room is still there. I drive past it sometimes. Every time I do, I think about that silence after Colton sat down. The way the room held its breath. I think about what I did with that silence. I built something out of it, the only way I know how. Patiently. Without making a scene, without saying a single word more than necessary. Same as I built everything else. I've thought a lot about what Colton said at that dinner. Not the words themselves, those I could have survived, but the calculation behind them. He didn't say those things because he was angry or drunk or momentarily out of control. He was composed. He'd thought about it. He chose a room full of witnesses, chose the one night I was supposed to be celebrated, and chose to perform his contempt with a raised glass and a smile. That's not honesty. That's strategy. And when someone shows you that clearly how they think, you owe it to yourself to believe them. I wasn't raised to be a vindictive man. My father worked 30 years in a machine shop, and he used to say that the loudest person in any argument had already lost it. I've tried to live by that. Most of the time it served me well, but there's a version of patience that is actually just fear. Fear of conflict, fear of loss, fear of being the one who pushes back. I spent 6 years confusing those two things where Colton was concerned. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I was being convenient. What I did after that dinner wasn't rage. I want to be honest about that. Rage burns fast and leaves ash. What I felt was colder and more deliberate than rage. It was the quiet recognition that I had extended trust and resources to someone who had contempt for both, and that I had every right and honestly every obligation to myself to stop. Every loan I called in, I had signed the paperwork for. Every concern I reported, I genuinely held. These weren't acts of destruction. They were the natural consequence of a man finally paying attention to what was actually in front of him. Here's what I believe about how life works. Separate from anything anyone has ever told me to believe. What you put into the world accumulates, not in a mystical sense. In a plain, mechanical, cause and effect sense. Colton spent 6 years accumulating contempt. For me, for the people who trusted him, for the basic decency of keeping your word. That accumulation didn't disappear because he was charming at dinner parties. It sat there, quiet, growing, waiting for one honest accounting. What happened to his business wasn't bad luck. It was arithmetic. And Nina. That's the part that matters most if I'm being completely honest. The business, the money, the property, those things are real but they're replaceable. Nina isn't. Watching her come back to herself these past months, hearing her laugh without that careful edge in it, watching her sit at the dinner table without monitoring every word before she says it. That's the thing I would trade everything else to have seen. Some of what I did made that possible. Some of it she did entirely on her own. I think she was stronger than either of us knew while she was inside that marriage. She just needed the weight of it lifted. I'm 63 years old. I've made money and I've lost money, and I'd learned that the only things that hold their value are the ones you built with actual integrity. The business relationships where you always did what you said, the friendships where you showed up when it wasn't convenient, the moments with your daughter where you told her the truth even when it was harder than telling her what she wanted to hear. Those things compound the same way debts do. They're just quieter about it. What I want people to take from this is simple. Know what you've signed. Know what you owed. And when someone stands up in a room and tells you exactly who they are, believe them the first time. You'll save yourself years,